Wes Calloway had $11 in his wallet, and a 7-year-old daughter waiting at school pickup in 40 minutes. He wasn't supposed to be at the Riverport County impound auction that morning. He was supposed to be fixing brake pads at Ferris Auto for $9 an hour. But his boss had let him go that morning. Slow season, not meeting Wes's eyes, and Wes had walked out into the gray parking lot with nothing but his toolbox and a knot in his stomach. The auction was a formality most days. Impounded cars, unpaid tickets, seized vehicles nobody claimed. Wes wondered, and only because the gate was open and it was free to look. Rows of dented sedans and a rusted pickup baked under a flat autumn sun. Then, at the very end of the row, half covered in a torn blue tarp, sat something else entirely. The tarp had slipped from one corner. Wes saw a curve of silver-gray metal, a headlight shaped like a teardrop, a grille that looked hand-forged rather than stamped. He pulled the tarp back further, and his breath caught. An Aston Martin. Old, filthy, one tire flat, a spiderweb crack across the windshield, moss growing along the door seam. The interior smelled of mildew and mouse nests. The engine, when he popped the hood, was seized solid, caked in rust and dead leaves. Nobody raised a hand. The car looked like scrap, like a coffin for something that used to run. Griggs shrugged. $200 going once. Wes didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was the shape of the thing, elegant even under 8 years of grime, like a retired boxer still standing straight. Maybe it was a mechanic's gut feeling that something under all that rust might be worth more than scrap. Maybe it was just that he had $211 to his name, and this was the only bid low enough to make. 200, Wes said, raising his hand before he could talk himself out of it. Going once, going twice, sold, to the man in the gray jacket. He paid with cash he'd meant to use for groceries, and had the flatbed drop it in the driveway of his rented duplex that evening. His daughter, Nora, stood on the porch steps in her school backpack, staring at the wreck being unloaded. It's a project, Wes said, though even he wasn't sure he believed it. That night, after Nora was asleep, Wes sat on an overturned bucket under a shop light and started pulling grime off the dashboard with a rag. Underneath the filth, the wood trim was real burl walnut, not plastic veneer. The seats, cracked as they were hand-stitched leather. And stamped into a small brass plate near the steering column was a chassis number, faint but legible, DB4/1029/L. Wes didn't know what that meant. But the next morning, before he even looked for another job, he searched it. The results made his hands shake. The number matched a 1961 Aston Martin DB4, one of a small handful of factory lightweight competition models built for endurance racing before Aston Martin shifted focus to the DB5. Fewer than 100 of that variant were ever made. Most were catalogued, sitting in private collections or museums. This one, according to a single grainy forum post from years earlier, had vanished after a private sale in the 1970s, and was long presumed scrapped or lost. He had 14 days before rent was due, no job, and a barely running car that might be worth a fortune, or might be a wreck with a lucky stamp number and nothing else. He sat at the kitchen table that first night with a calculator and a stack of overdue bills, weighing the $200 he'd just spent against the $211 he'd had that morning, and understood, in a way he hadn't fully let himself feel until then, exactly how thin the ice under his family had become. There was no cushion left. No relative to call, no savings account to dip into. Whatever this car turned out to be, it was going to have to be enough, because there was nothing else behind it. Wes spent those 14 days like a man possessed. He borrowed a battery from his neighbor to test the electrics. He drained 8 years of sludge out of the fuel lines. He called in every favor he had. An old co-worker at Ferris Auto let him use the lift after hours, A retired mechanic 3 streets over lent him a manual for engines from that era that hadn't been printed since the Nixon administration. Nora sat on a stool most evenings doing her homework in the garage, handing her dad wrenches like a tiny apprentice, asking 100 questions about pistons and gaskets he did his best to answer between exhausted breaths. On day 6, the engine turned over for the first time in 8 years, not started, just turned, freed from its rust, and Wes let out a shout so loud Nora came running with a screwdriver in her hand, ready to help with whatever emergency she imagined. He laughed until his eyes stung, sitting on the concrete floor with grease up to his elbows, and for a moment, the eviction notice folded in his back pocket didn't matter at all. Nora sat down next to him without asking why, the way kids do, when they sense something important is happening but don't yet need the details, and just leaned her head against his shoulder while the engine ticked as it cooled. On day 9, he found something that changed everything. Tucked behind the glove box lining, wrapped in a decayed plastic sleeve, was a folded set of original factory build documents and a handwritten note, water-stained but readable, referencing a private commission and a name Wes recognized from racing history forums as a driver who had died in a crash decades earlier. His personal effects scattered and lost after his estate was sold off in a hurry. The documents, if authenticated, would prove the exact provenance collectors dream about. A genuine, numbers-matching factory lightweight, tied to a known driver thought destroyed, sitting in his driveway in a duplex he could barely afford. On day 11, Wes drove, carefully, at 15 miles an hour, terrified the whole way, to a small appraisal shop 2 towns over that specialized in pre-war and mid-century European classics. The appraiser, a soft-spoken woman named Priya Osei, walked around the car twice without saying a word, then knelt by the front-wheel arch and ran her fingers along a factory stamp only a handful of people in the country would know to look for. "Where did you get this car?" she said quietly, not as a question but as a demand, her eyes still fixed on the stamp. Wes told her. $200. A county impound auction. 8 years abandoned. She laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of someone watching a lottery ticket get handed to a stranger. "If this is what I think it is," Priya said, "and if that paperwork checks out, you didn't just buy a car. You bought one of maybe 6 surviving examples of a vehicle collectors have been hunting for 40 years. This isn't a 6-figure car, Mr. Calloway. This is an 8-figure car." Wes had to sit down on an overturned crate in the corner of her shop. Word moves fast in small, obsessive worlds. Within 72 hours, 3 separate collectors had called Wes's cell phone, numbers he never gave out, somehow found through the appraisal shop's network. One offered $4 million on the spot, cash, no questions. Wes almost said yes out of sheer disbelief that the number was real. But Priya, now acting as his advisor, told him to be patient, to let a proper auction house handle it, to let the story and the documents speak for themselves. On day 14, exactly 2 weeks after he'd raised his hand for $200 in a gravel lot, Wes stood in the back of a crowded auction room in a rented suit that didn't quite fit, watching men and women in far better suits raise paddles for a car he had once thought was scrap. The bidding opened at $2 million and did not slow down. It climbed past 4, past 6, past 8, 2 determined bidders refusing to back off, the auctioneer's voice rising with each new number until, finally, a phone bidder from overseas closed it out. The room erupted into applause, the kind reserved for something rare surviving against the odds, cameras flashing near the front row, a few collectors already pulling out phones to call people who weren't there, someone behind him murmuring that they'd been chasing that chassis number since the 90s, and never once thought they'd see it cross an auction block. Wes barely heard any of it. He was looking at Nora, who had begged to come, and was sitting beside him in her good dress, mouth open, not understanding the number so much as understanding her father's face. "Dad," she whispered, "is that really our car?" "It was," Wes said, throat tight. "Not anymore. But it did something for us nobody thought it could."